I never thought my life could change in one night. But then the car broke down, and we ended up stuck in a tiny hotel room. Just me and my stepson. The room was suffocating, the tension unbearable. But when I caught him looking at me that way, everything shifted. It was the kind of moment that changes you forever. Let me tell you how it all began. Life felt like it was stuck in a rut. Ever since Logan, my husband, had taken a job in another city, things just weren't the same. Nights felt colder, days lonelier, and the little texts and calls between us weren't enough to fill the void. I tried to keep busy, pretending everything was fine, but deep down, I craved more. I missed the way things used to be, the connection, the warmth, the attention. Gary, my 22-year-old stepson, had recently moved back home for the summer before heading to college. He was a carefree, quirky guy who could make anyone laugh, including me. Despite his jokes and laid-back attitude, I often found myself feeling restless even in his company. He was Logan's son, after all, and the thought of relying on him for emotional support felt off. The morning everything started, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. At 47, I still had that spark, even if I didn't always feel it. "Let's go," I told Gary, determined to see Logan and maybe rekindle what had been slipping away. "You need the driving practice anyway." He grinned, tossing his car keys into the air with a cheeky confidence that always annoyed me just a little. We hit the road with no idea what awaited us. Gary's jokes and off-tune singing filled the car, a mix of lightheartedness and something deeper, something I tried not to dwell on. But when the car sputtered and died, leaving us stranded miles from anywhere, everything changed. Stuck on a deserted stretch of highway, our options dwindled quickly. After hours of failed attempts to fix the car or reach a mechanic, we had no choice but to stay at the nearest motel. My heart sank as I stepped into the cramped room. One tiny bed, a flickering overhead light, and a window that faced nothing but a parking lot. I glanced at Gary, who threw himself onto the bed with that same teasing grin. "Relax, it's just one night," he said. But the way he looked at me in that moment, it felt different. Like there was an unspoken tension neither of us dared to acknowledge. I had no idea that this night in this room would change everything. From the moment we entered that dimly lit motel room, I could feel something shift. The air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite name. Gary's carefree attitude, his jokes, and that ever-present smirk, it all seemed harmless on the surface. But as the hours passed, cracks started to form in the facade of our roles as stepmother and stepson. After settling into the room, I tried to distract myself from the situation. I unpacked a few things, checked my phone for the 100th time, and avoided making eye contact with Gary. But it was impossible to ignore the space, or lack of it. The room was so small that every move felt like an intrusion into each other's personal space. Gary, of course, seemed completely unfazed. He sprawled out on the bed, scrolling through his phone and humming to himself. At one point, he caught me glancing his way. "What's up, Carmen? You look like you're plotting an escape plan," he joked. I forced a laugh, brushing off the unease that had settled in my chest. "Just tired, that's all," I said, but it was more than that. I couldn't shake the feeling that his gaze lingered a little too long, or that his teasing carried an edge I hadn't noticed before. As the evening wore on, the oppressive heat of the room became unbearable. The tiny air conditioner in the corner sputtered weakly, doing little to help. I decided to take a shower, hoping it would clear my head. When I emerged, the cool air on my damp skin did little to calm my racing thoughts. Gary sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes flickering toward me for just a second too long. "Feel better?" he asked, his voice light but his expression unreadable. "Much better," I lied, pulling my robe tighter around me. Later, as I sat by the window, sipping on a glass of water, I noticed Gary watching me. He wasn't trying to hide it anymore. His gaze wasn't just casual, it was deliberate, searching. I felt my cheeks flush, and my heart raced for reasons I didn't want to admit. "What?" I asked, forcing a smile to cover my nervousness. He shrugged, a playful grin tugging at his lips. "Nothing. You just seem different tonight." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I wanted to brush it off, laugh it away, but I couldn't. Instead, I stood and moved toward the bed, trying to shake the unease building inside me. As I lay down on my side of the bed, Gary shifted closer. Not much, but enough to make me aware of every inch between us. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional rustle of sheets. In the darkness, I couldn't help but think about Logan. How distant he had been lately, how neglected I'd felt. I told myself it was just the heat, the circumstances, the frustration of being stuck in this situation. But deep down, I knew there was something more. Gary's breathing was steady beside me, yet I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed every glance, every subtle shift in his tone, every moment that had felt just a little too loaded. Was I imagining it, or was he feeling it too? It was impossible to ignore the tension that crackled between us, unspoken but undeniable. I turned my back to him, hoping the distance would make it easier to pretend everything was normal. But even then, I could feel his presence, as if the room itself had grown smaller, trapping us in a moment neither of us could escape. The room felt suffocating, the tension thick as if it had a life of its own. Every little sound, Gary shifting on the bed, the hum of the air conditioner, even my own breathing, seemed amplified in the silence. I told myself to sleep, to stop overthinking, but my body wouldn't listen. I rolled over to find Gary lying on his back, one arm draped over his forehead, the other resting on his chest. His robe had loosened slightly, revealing the lean lines of his torso. He was no longer a boy, I realized, but a man, confident and composed in ways that made me question everything. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice breaking the stillness. I hesitated before answering, trying to keep my tone light. "Not with this heat." He chuckled softly. "Yeah, this place isn't exactly paradise. But hey, it's just one night, right?" There was that grin again, the one that always seemed to carry more weight than it should. I nodded and turned away, hoping the darkness would hide the flush creeping up my neck. But even with my back to him, I couldn't escape the pull of his presence. When I finally drifted off, it didn't last long. A soft sound woke me in the middle of the night, a shift of the mattress, a rustle of sheets. I opened my eyes just enough to see Gary sitting at the edge of the bed. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were lost in thought. I watched him through half-closed eyes, pretending to be asleep. The way he looked at me, it wasn't casual. It wasn't innocent. My heart raced, and I had to remind myself to keep breathing evenly, to stay still. Then, as if testing some unspoken boundary, Gary untied the belt of his robe. The fabric slipped from his shoulders, revealing his toned frame in the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. I felt a warmth rise in me that I couldn't explain, let alone control. I wanted to turn away, to close my eyes and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I didn't. I couldn't. Gary stood and crossed the room to the wardrobe, pulling out a pair of shorts. He glanced back at me as if checking to see if I was awake. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept up the facade, my breathing steady and my eyes barely open. When he turned back to the bed, he didn't lie down. Instead, he sat in the chair by the window, his gaze fixed on me. Being watched like that, so intently, so openly, was both unsettling and thrilling. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but also wanted. I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "Gary," I said, my tone firmer than I expected. "What are you doing?" He didn't flinch. His eyes held mine with a quiet intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. I can't stop thinking about you." His words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. I should have shut it down, drawn a line, reminded him, and myself, of who we were to each other. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself drawn to the honesty in his eyes, the vulnerability in his voice. "This is crazy," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Maybe," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But it doesn't feel wrong." I stared at him, my mind racing with 1,000 reasons to put an end to this. And yet my body betrayed me. I stood and crossed the room, each step bringing me closer to him, closer to something I couldn't name but desperately wanted to understand. When I reached him, I stopped, unsure of what to say or do. The silence between us was deafening, filled with all the words we couldn't say. Gary reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was electric, sending a jolt through me that I felt in every nerve. I should have pulled away, but instead I stayed, letting the moment stretch on, letting the unspoken feelings between us take over. "You make this hard, you know," I said softly, my voice trembling. His smile widened, but his eyes remained serious. "And you make it impossible to ignore," he replied. In that moment, I stopped thinking. I stopped questioning. All I knew was that I was standing here, in this tiny motel room, with a man who saw me in a way I hadn't been seen in years. And for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. I told myself to stop, to pull away, to end whatever was building between us before it spiraled completely out of control. But as I stood there, inches away from Gary, the boundaries I'd carefully built over the years felt like they were crumbling into dust. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner, but inside, my thoughts were a storm. Gary's gaze locked onto mine, searching for something, permission maybe, or reassurance that he wasn't alone in this. "This is wrong," I murmured, though the words felt hollow, like an excuse I didn't really believe. "Then why does it feel so right?" Gary replied, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the turmoil he was trying to hide. I wanted to argue, to tell him this wasn't about feelings but about lines that couldn't be crossed. But instead, I found myself leaning in, drawn to the intensity of his presence. His hand reached up, brushing against my arm, and the warmth of his touch sent shivers through me. It was a mistake, I knew that much. But as his fingers lightly traced the curve of my wrist, I couldn't bring myself to stop him. My breath hitched, and I saw the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. For a moment, I thought he might pull away, might let me escape the gravity of what was happening. But then he moved closer. "You're not just my stepmom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're more than that. You've always been more." His words hit me like a wave, breaking down the last of my defenses. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the emotions rushing through me, but it was no use. I could feel his breath against my cheek, the closeness of him overwhelming every rational thought I had left. And then it happened. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as if waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself responding, leaning into the kiss with a desperation I hadn't felt in years. It was slow, almost hesitant, but it carried a weight that neither of us could ignore. The room seemed to vanish around us, the tiny motel and the circumstances that had brought us here fading into the background. All I could feel was the heat between us, the pull that had been building all night finally breaking free. When we pulled apart, his eyes searched mine, looking for regret, for doubt. But all he found was a mirror of his own emotions, confusion, longing, and a kind of reckless abandon that neither of us could deny. "This can't happen," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "It already has," he replied, and the truth of his words hung between us like a shadow. I stepped back, putting space between us, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. How had we gotten here? How could I face Logan after this? And yet, as I looked at Gary, I couldn't deny the spark that had ignited between us, the connection that felt as undeniable as it was forbidden. The moment shattered when my phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the spell. I grabbed it, desperate for a distraction, but the sight of Logan's name on the screen only made the weight of what had just happened feel heavier. "I need to take this," I said, my voice shaking. Gary nodded, stepping back, but his eyes never left mine. As I answered the call, I could hear Logan's voice on the other end, cheerful and oblivious to the storm raging inside me. "Hey, Carmen, how's the trip going? Did Gary get you there safely?" My throat tightened, guilt washing over me in waves. We ran into some car trouble," I managed, forcing a smile into my voice. "We're at a motel for the night. Gary's been great, really helpful." "That's my boy," Logan said, laughing. "Well, I can't wait to see you both tomorrow. Drive safe, okay?" As the call ended, I turned back to Gary, who was now sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly together. The playful grin he usually wore was gone, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite read. Part regret, part determination. "We can't let this go any further," I said, my voice firm this time. "This was a mistake." Gary nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, defiance maybe, or hope. "If that's what you want," he said, his tone even. "But I don't think either of us believes that." His words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I turned away, staring out the tiny window at the empty parking lot. The night felt heavy, oppressive, and the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like a stone. For the rest of the night, we kept our distance, the silence between us louder than any argument could have been. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while Gary stayed in the chair by the window, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of a street lamp. When morning came, the tension was palpable. Gary left early to get the car fixed, and I spent the time pacing the room, trying to make sense of everything. By the time he returned, the easygoing smile was back on his face, but there was a shadow behind it that hadn't been there before. "We're all set," he said, his tone casual. "Let's go pick up Dad." The drive to Logan City was quiet, the unspoken weight of the night before hanging between us. I couldn't bring myself to look at Gary, and yet I felt his presence more keenly than ever. As we pulled up to Logan's office, I forced a smile, pushing everything else aside. Logan greeted us with open arms, completely unaware of the storm that had brewed in his absence. But as Gary and I exchanged a brief glance, I knew that night would never truly leave us. It had changed something between us, something we could never undo. The days that followed were a blur of forced smiles and awkward silences. Logan was overjoyed to have us both with him, his family reunited after months apart. But every time I looked at Gary, I felt the weight of our shared secret pressing down on me, threatening to crush everything I had worked so hard to build. I thought I could compartmentalize it, lock it away in some dark corner of my mind, and pretend it had never happened. But the truth had a way of seeping through the cracks. It was in the stolen glances Gary and I exchanged when Logan wasn't looking, the fleeting touches that felt both accidental and deliberate, the way my heart raced whenever he was near. Logan didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but the guilt was eating me alive. Every time he reached for my hand or kissed my cheek, I felt like a fraud. I kept telling myself it had been a moment of weakness, a mistake born out of loneliness and vulnerability. But deep down, I wasn't sure that was true. Gary, on the other hand, seemed unaffected, or at least he hid it well. He laughed at Logan's jokes, helped around the house, and carried on like nothing had happened. But when we were alone, even for a moment, the air between us was charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. One evening, Logan suggested a family dinner at a nearby restaurant. "It'll be nice to spend some time together," he said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. I forced a smile and agreed, though the thought of sitting across from Gary for an entire meal felt unbearable. At the restaurant, I barely tasted the food. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, and every time Gary's leg brushed against mine under the table, I felt like I was about to lose my composure. Logan, oblivious as ever, kept the conversation flowing, asking Gary about his plans for college and telling stories from his work. But then, halfway through the meal, Gary said something that made my heart stop. "Dad, you've been working so hard lately. Maybe you should take some time off and spend it with Carmen. She misses you, you know." His words were innocent enough on the surface, but the way he looked at me when he said them, it was like he was testing me, daring me to react. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my face flush. Logan smiled, reaching for my hand across the table. "Is that true, Carmen?" he asked, his voice warm and full of affection. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Of course. I always miss you." Gary's gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before he looked away, a faint smirk playing on his lips. I clenched my hands in my lap, trying to steady myself. After dinner, Logan suggested a walk by the water. The cool evening air was a welcome relief, but the tension between Gary and me only grew stronger. At one point, Logan walked ahead to take a phone call, leaving Gary and me alone on the path. The silence between us was deafening. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. "You seem quiet," Gary said, his tone casual but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I didn't respond. I couldn't trust myself to speak without saying something I'd regret. "You don't have to avoid me, you know," he continued, stepping closer. "I get it. It's complicated. But you don't have to act like I don't exist." I stopped walking and turned to face him, my voice trembling. "This isn't a game, Gary. What happened? It can't happen again. It was a mistake." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "If that's what you want," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "But you should know, I don't think it was a mistake." Before I could respond, Logan called out to us, waving us over with a cheerful smile. I forced myself to smile back and followed Gary down the path, my mind spinning. That night, as I lay in bed next to Logan, I couldn't sleep. His arm draped over me felt like a weight, a reminder of the line I had crossed. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the events of the past few days over and over in my mind. By the time morning came, I had made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between my guilt and the undeniable pull I felt toward Gary. Something had to give, even if it meant tearing my life apart in the process. As I watched Logan sleeping peacefully beside me, I realized I had no idea how to fix this. All I knew was that the fallout from that night in the motel was far from over, and the consequences were only just beginning. In the days that followed, I found myself trapped in a web of my own making. The guilt weighed heavily on me, gnawing at my every thought. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memory of that night with Gary, or the way it had awakened something inside me that I had long ignored. Logan's presence only made it harder. He was as attentive as ever, trying to make up for the time we had spent apart. Every kind gesture, every loving word, felt like a knife to the heart. How could I have betrayed someone so good, so trusting? Gary, on the other hand, seemed unbothered, or at least he pretended to be. He acted as though nothing had happened, slipping easily back into the role of the charming, easygoing stepson. But when we were alone, the tension was unmistakable. It was in the way he looked at me, the way his voice softened when he said my name. It was a constant reminder that no matter how much I wanted to forget, neither of us could undo what had been done. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the kitchen, staring out the window as the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm me. The sound of footsteps behind me made my stomach drop, and I turned to see Gary standing in the doorway. "We need to talk," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I shook my head, my chest tightening. "There's nothing to talk about, Gary. It was a mistake, and it's over." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe for you. But for me? It's not that simple." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could I say? That I felt the same? That I wished I didn't? "You don't have to say anything," he continued, his voice softer now. I needed you to know. I don't regret what happened. And I don't think you do either." Tears welled up in my eyes as I turned away, unable to face him. "You don't understand," I whispered. "This isn't just about us. It's about Logan. It's about everything we could destroy." "And what about you?" he asked, his voice full of emotion. "What about what you want? What you feel?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. That evening, as I lay in bed beside Logan, I stared at the ceiling, replaying Gary's words in my mind. What about what you want? The question haunted me, forcing me to confront the truth I had been avoiding for so long. I had spent years trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect partner. But in doing so, I had ignored my own needs, my own desires. That night in the motel had forced me to see what I had been missing, not just in my marriage, but in myself. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living a lie, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I owed it to Logan, and to myself, to face the truth. Sitting across from Logan at the breakfast table, I took a deep breath and prepared to tell him everything. But as I looked into his eyes, full of love and trust, the words caught in my throat. I couldn't do it, not yet. Instead, I resolved to start small. To be honest with myself first. To figure out what I wanted, what I needed, before making any decisions that could shatter our lives. And as I watched Gary from across the room, his easy smile masking the turmoil beneath, I realized that this journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Life is messy, complicated, and full of choices that define who we are. And while I didn't have all the answers yet, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep running from the truth. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that tackle life's most complicated and taboo moments. Your engagement means the world to me, and there's so much more to explore together. Stay tuned for next week's story. It's one you won't want to miss.